Well, a big thanks for having us here at Crunch today. So I'm Heather Dansie, and I run the insight output for Newsworks, and I'm here with Niki, who's the Director of Agency and Client Services at Newsworks. So for those of you that don't know, Newsworks is the marketing body for the UK's national news publishing industry. And our role is essentially to act as a cheerleaders for the UK news brands, by which we mean all the lovely content that news publishers put out across their many channels, whether that is print or digital, podcasts, radio, audio, video, the whole spectrum. We champion the importance of a free press, and ultimately we try to encourage advertising revenue to flow into the industry to fund all the brilliant journalism that news brands produce every single day. And we're delighted to be here to shine a light on the impact of misinformation and disinformation, the role that journalism plays in acting as an antidote to fake news, and why trust has never been more important, especially for advertisers. So, as you all know, trust or a lack of it is something that we've been hearing a lot about even through in the press. So whether it's Partygate or the Met Police or unregulated online content, the disastrous mini budget and all the ongoing effects that came from that, the deep fakes, conspiracy theories. So there is this sense that we are in the middle of a trust crisis. And being able to turn to trusted information in a world where fake news and misinformation really does pervade all levels of our society is crucial. So, we have a real sense that trust has never been more important. And to set some context around trust and particularly news brands in the first instance, there's some research that we conducted last year which indicates that 4 in 5 people in the UK are concerned about the rise in fake news. And in our more recent 2024 trends analysis, we discovered that a fifth of Brits believed that fake news and misinformation was one of the greatest challenges that we were to be facing this year. And the result is from this is we're going to show you that people actively are turning to news brands for regulated content that they can trust. Because while there are often times when we really, really want stories to be true, like the Pope leaving the Vatican in his white puffer, sadly, they aren't. And regardless of this, fake news are taking off all around the globe. And this was a huge concern in the lead up to the general election, and because fake news can have some really serious consequences. So we ran a specific study looking at the impact of fake news at the end of June. So it was just before election day. And we found that over half had seen or had thought they had seen fake news. And this doesn't count, of course, all the fake news that they had seen and had believed. And unsurprisingly, the results were much higher for those aged 18 to 24, where nearly 3/4 had been aware that they had come into contact with fake news. So this is one of the reasons why people consistently turn to regulated, trusted news environments to verify where they read elsewhere. We've heard already that this morning, demonstrating that they're a really crucial part of the media ecosystem, both for society and for individual people. So there is an acronym that is increasingly being used in places of education to combat fake news. It's SIFT. I assume some of you may have heard this, but it stands for STOP. So fact check your feed. So we found that in our data that 70% say they exercise caution when sharing a news story with others, to investigate the source. So I often question things that come across the media is something that people have told us. People are to find trusted coverage. So 74% turn to news brands' websites to verify the stories they read in social media and trace to the original. So we've also found that 61% say they always look for the sources of a news story in the media. So it's changing people's behaviour as they're reading content. And this trust in UK journalism means that people consider news brand sources 2.5 times more reliable than social media. It makes them more than twice as likely to describe print or online news brands as factual and accurate compared to social media. As it's starting to, the regulated environment of news brands means that 73% of people agree that it's important that their source of news is from a regulated news provider. So this is all consciously claimed and people have a real sense of it. But we decided we'd also run a test and found that headlines from news brands were far more likely to be believed than those from non-news brands. What we found was, aggregated across all the different types of headlines that we looked at, the headlines from news brands were felt to be much more believable by the public. In fact, more than 50% more believable. And even for people who don't necessarily have an affinity with a particular news brand, the headlines were still more likely to be believed. And when we looked at the readers of news brands, the percentage is much higher, increasing to 75%. Well, why is this? Well, they were 40% more likely to say, I trust the news source more. And this greater believability and trust in the headlines results in more action as people showed a greater confidence to act. So people were more likely to look at the news story, they were more likely to talk about it with others, and they were more likely to want to share it. So we hopefully established that quality journalism and news brands are highly trusted. But what do we mean when we talk about the term trust? And there's a huge irony in the fact that we don't always trust the term trust. It can be quite a slippery term when it's used in research. So to illustrate the point, you can see here an example from the 2023 Edelman Trust Barometer that comes out globally every year, and it's referred to widely within business communities. So on the surface, it shows a decline of trust in business in the most developed parts of the world. But what are people really being asked here? So the question posed is, here's a list of institutions. For each one, please indicate how much you trust that institution to do what is right on a 9-point scale. So what do we mean by to do what is right? What is it right for a business to do? Is it make a good product or make a good return for its shareholders, making a difference socially? So as an example, I totally trust that Amazon will deliver my parcel on time, but I might not necessarily trust as much their business practices. So where would I score Amazon on a question like this? What exactly are we measuring? Is there a better definition of trust? So to understand this concept a bit further, we carried out quite some extensive research into it. And we know that trust is important to people because essentially trust helps us make confident predictions about other people or things based on limited information. It allows us to act whilst thinking less. Now, from a brand perspective, this means a greater mental availability for brands. So an expert in trust from the MIT Sloan School of Management, Shamila Chatterjee, she has noted a brand that reliably delivers on its promise reinforces the perception of that brand as reliable, which encourages repeat use, which increases the numbers of interactions. So this strengthens the linkages and it makes it easier for consumers to recall. So for the same dollar investment in advertising, a high trust brand would reap a larger increase in its share of market versus its low trust competitors. And so trust matters because it increases the mental availability for a brand. So I'm going to hand over to you.
Okay, so we know what trust is. We know it's really important to people, and we know why trust is good for brands. But the question is, and the question that we were asking ourselves at Newsworks is, how do brands build trust? And I suppose before we try and move the dial on trust, we need a better way of measuring it. So we did some work with a research company called Tapestry last year to really try and work out what the building blocks are that make up trust. And our analysis reveals that there are 4 things that should always be considered if you want to get your trust markers right. 2 are what we call positive emotional factors, and then 2 are negative rational factors. So the first 2 that you can see on the left-hand side is familiarity and fame. And these are the 2 positive emotional factors which we found really boost brand trust. And then competence, or I suppose incompetence, and risk on the right-hand side here are the things which drag brand trust down. And by measuring trust in this way, what it enables, I suppose, agencies and marketers to do is really see which areas of trust they're doing well in and getting right, and where they need to improve. So it can be a really, I suppose, interesting marketing decision tool to use. And by measuring interest in this way, what we found was that news brands score 6.2 out of 10 in terms of their overall composite trust based on each of those 4 different trust pillars. And that's second only to commercial TV at 7.5 and slightly higher, I suppose, pretty much the same as radio news. And when you think about it, it's not really surprising that TV has a slightly stronger level of trust compared to news brands because, TV is highly controlled versus the more fluid nature of the news that breaks within news brand environment. And I think even if you don't watch the news at 10, it's very familiar to people. They know what the format is. They're not taking any risks with it. It's more just recapping the big stories of the day. But the big thing to note here is that news brands are strongly ahead of other online news sources and social media when it comes to that composite trust measure. And I suppose it's worth noting that in that other online news sources group are things like BuzzFeed, Vox, Vice, Quartz, The Atlantic and so forth. And news brands have a 50% higher level of trust than these other online news sources at 4.1 versus 6.2, and much stronger trust also compared